Hey, what's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in. Really want to welcome you into our new episode of Rutabagas of the Spirit. New episode. I don't even know if you would call it a new episode, new video, new drop. I don't know, but hey, welcome to Rutabagas of the Spirit. If for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jesus Vera. I'm the intern pastor at Journey SDA, and just really want to welcome you to today's Rutabagas of the Spirit. I already said that. I don't know why I said it again, but last week, if you haven't got a chance to check out last week's Rutabagas of the Spirit, I highly recommend you check that out. Miss Cassandra and Pastor Adam really dove into that last chapter of Inspired by Rachel Held Evans, and it was so good. And this week, I'm going to be hopping on, and I'll be sharing another favorite chapter of mine by God of the Oppressed. Today, I'll just be starting chapter 8, which is on Jesus and Black suffering. But I'll be sharing today on chapter 6, which talks about who is Jesus Christ today. But definitely recommend you guys to go check out last week's. And next week, we should be starting a new book called Just Mercy. So this week, you kind of get a break. I know you guys probably don't have this book, but make sure to sometime throughout this week, go on Amazon or something, and just look up Just Mercy and make sure to buy that so you can be ready to follow along with us next week as we begin that book. Yeah, so like I said, today we're going to be going over chapter 6 of God of the Oppressed by James Cone. If you haven't got a chance to check out the other Rutabagas of the Spirit where I talked about this book, James Cone is a leading theologian on Black theology and liberation theology. So I definitely recommend. This is a little bit more theological if you're into that type of stuff. This is a really good book. And we're just living in such a social tension and political tension where I think that this book is a must read for all Christians, to be honest. Not even for all Christians, for everyone, because this really dives into the Black liberation struggle and how God is really moving in that movement. So like I said, today we'll be going over chapter 6, and it's titled, Who is Jesus Christ for us today? Don't expect a super long video. I just made a couple points that I wanted to emphasize, and I'm just jump straight in. So one of the first things that this chapter talks about is that if we want to recognize who Jesus Christ is for us today, we can't just be solely focused on scripture. And so what do I mean by that? I'm not saying to not pay attention to what scripture is telling us, but there's a couple of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about Jesus in 2020. And so the things that we have to think about really is just three. We have to think about social context, scripture, and tradition, because we can't just focus on any of those parts alone. We need all those three. And when we take those three and we really combine them and study all three of those, right? We study scripture, and then we study the social context of Jesus, the social context of the early church, and then we study the tradition of the early church, of the later church, of the Reformation, of the American church, stuff like that. When we study all those things, to be honest, we're gonna come to realize that at the heart of that, the recurring theme of Jesus is actually freedom. So for us to identify who Jesus Christ is for us today, we need to look at the following 4 points. That's going to be Jesus is who he was, Jesus is who he is, Jesus is who he will be, and Jesus is Black. Save the best for last. You know what I mean? So the first thing, I'm going to just get straight into it. I'm going to be reading a couple of segments that I like just because I think paraphrasing or reiterating it in my words just isn't enough. It won't be doing you guys justice. I want you guys to hear James Cone, his original words, and I think that would really help us, inspire us, and really just challenge our current patterns of thinking, right? So the first thing that we have to recognize when we think about Jesus in 2020 is that Jesus is who he was. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I think we often forget that Jesus was human. Jesus, about 2,000 years ago, he was actually born, right? He was a baby. He cried. He grew up. He hurt himself. He would play. And Jesus was a personal human being that lived in our history. And I think we often forget that. We kind of paint Jesus as this person, this really divine being who didn't live in our history, but that's not true. Jesus walked this earth. Jesus ate the same food we ate. Jesus drank the same things we drank. Jesus played probably similar games that we played growing up. Like, Jesus was a human being. Like, just because he was the Son of God, it doesn't take away from the fact that he was also human. He also was a historical being that we study, that we can look at, that we can study. And one way that we can recognize this is by looking at the Gospels. You know, the Gospels, they're not just fiction. They're not just feel-good stories that we turn to. They're actually the telling of God's way of changing the course of history through one human being, right? The Gospels talks about the life of Jesus. It talks about the life of Jesus so that we can understand how one human being in history completely changed the course of the entirety of creation, the entirety of all the universe. And because we recognize that Jesus was also human, then we also come to the conclusion that, hey, Jesus also suffered. And I want to read a direct quote to explain that better. So I'm going to be reading from page 109 of God of the Oppressed. Somehow you have the book. You could go ahead and follow along with me. So in this idea that Jesus suffers because he's also human, right? It says the humanity of Jesus was the emphasis of black slaves when they sang about his suffering and pain during the crucifixion. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And then it keeps saying, with deep passion and a transcendent leap back into first century Jerusalem, black people describe the details of Jesus' suffering on the cross. They whooped him up the hill. They crowned him with a thorny crown. They nailed him to the cross. They pierced him in the side. The blood came twinkling down, and he never said a mumbling word. He just hung his head and he died. Unless the biblical story is historically right and its picture of the humanity of Jesus, then there is no reason to believe that he shared our suffering and pain. The authenticity of the New Testament Jesus guarantees the integrity of his human presence with the poor and the wretched in the struggle of freedom. In Jesus' presence with the poor in Palestine, he disclosed who they were and what they were created to be. Likewise, we today in 2020 can lay claim on the same humanity that was liberated through Jesus' cross and resurrection. Because Jesus lived, we now know that servitude is inhumane and that Christ has set us free to live as liberated sons and daughters of God. Unless Jesus was truly like us, then we have no reason to believe that our true humanity is disclosed in his person. Without Jesus' humanity constituted in real history, we have no basis to contend that his coming bestows upon us the courage and the wisdom to struggle against injustice and oppression. All that means is that because Jesus was human, because Jesus suffered the same sufferings we endured, and because Jesus throughout his ministry always stood up for marginalized and oppressed communities, right? Because he died on that cross, we can take that life of Jesus and we can embody that right now in 2020. And so that leads us to our second point, or the second point that James Cone makes, is that Jesus is who he is. You see, Jesus wasn't just alive in our past history. He wasn't just someone who just lived and died, right? Jesus is still alive in our present context today, right? And so I'm going to keep reading from page 110, and it says this. To declare that God raised Jesus from the dead is to say that our knowledge of Jesus is not limited to his life in Palestine. Jesus is not merely a historical person who once identified with the poor people of his land and subsequently was executed by the Roman authorities for disturbing the social and political status quo. The crucified one is also the risen Lord. Faith in the resurrection means that the historical Jesus, in his liberating words and deeds for the poor, was God's way of breaking into human history, redeeming humanity from injustice and violence, and bestowing power upon little ones in their struggle for freedom, right? And on this idea that Jesus is who he is, I want to jump to page 112 real quick and just read this one sentence. It says that Jesus has not left us alone, but is with us in the struggle of freedom. And I really want to tie that in with something that he says in the next couple pages in page 115. It says that he is also the divine one who transcends the limitations of history by making himself present in our contemporary existence. This is the meaning of Jesus' resurrection. When God raised Jesus from the dead, God affirmed that Jesus' historical identity with the freedom of the poor was in fact divinity taking on humanity for the purpose of liberating human beings from sin and death. It is within this context that the resurrection is a political event. The politics of the resurrection is found in its gift of freedom to the poor and the helpless. This new knowledge about themselves and the world requires that the poor practice political activity against the social and economic structure that makes them poor. Not to fight is to deny the freedom of the resurrection. It is to deny the reality of Christ's presence with us in the struggle to liberate the slaves from bondage. This is the political side of the resurrection. Because Jesus is who he is, he calls us as humanity into freedom. And if we as humanity decide not to fight for freedom, then we're denying the resurrection. Jesus is calling us to stand up. Jesus is calling us to fight all this inequality, to fight all this injustice. Jesus is calling us to fight against all forms of suffering. Jesus Christ does not call humanity into bondage, into slavery, into oppression. Jesus calls humanity time and time and time again into freedom, and not just freedom from sin, right? He calls humanity into freedom from oppression, from marginalization, from systematic racism, from political powers, from injustice, from suffering. This is things that, because of the person of Jesus, we as Christians, we as believers can stand up. These are things that we can do. And we're seeing it happening right now in our present reality, in our present context of 2020. You see what's going on in Portland. I don't even know if most of those people are believers or not, but I guarantee that Jesus is on those same streets of Portland, fighting against that type of oppression and injustice. Jesus is on those streets. Jesus is anytime people are standing up and fighting against injustice, I guarantee you that's where Jesus is, because that's the political side of the resurrection. The political side of resurrection tears down bondage, breaks down walls, and creates unity within humanity. And I just think that that's really powerful. But all this leads us into Jesus is who he will be. And I read from page 116, it says, the meaning of Jesus Christ for us today is not limited to his past and present existence. Jesus Christ is who he will be. He is not only the crucified and risen one, but also the Lord of the future, who is coming again to fully consummate the liberation already happening in our present. This idea of Jesus is who he will be can be defined into one word, and this word is hope. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of hope is this? Because I think that somewhere down the line in tradition, that idea of hope got distorted, right? And it's really evident in the American church. It's really evident once people started to lift their Bibles and look at people and say, God says you deserve to be my slave. God says, I'm your master. Then we recognize that hope has been distorted, right? And it's the same thing that James Cone is saying. It says, how can Christian theology truly speak of the hope of Jesus Christ unless that hope begins and ends with the liberation of the poor in the social existence in which theology takes shape? In America, this means that there can be no talk about hope in the Christian sense unless it is talk about the freedom of black, red, and brown people. In the Christian church today in America and anywhere around the world, there can be no talk of hope. And this to me is just mind-blowing, because this is something that we always talk about in our churches. We always talk about the hope of the Advent, the hope of Jesus' second coming. But what James Cone is saying is that we cannot talk about that unless we are truly fighting for Black Lives Matter, unless we are truly fighting for the indigenous people of this land, unless we are really fighting for all the immigrants in this land, unless we are really fighting for all the kids locked in cages in our border, unless we're really fighting for all the families on welfare, unless we're really fighting for everyone in this country, in this world, who is being oppressed and marginalized. It says we cannot talk about hope unless we are really standing up for that. And I can reassure you, here at Journey, we are really doing that. We are really standing up and fighting for the right reasons, because we've come to know the Jesus of the Gospels. And we've come to know that, hey, Jesus was a real person. Hey, Jesus is the risen and crucified Lord. Hey, and Jesus is the one who is coming in the future. But we have to get to work in our present context. And that's really what I'm trying to get across today, is that hope needs to be redefined to its original source. And its original source is the Jesus Christ that we read about in the Gospels. And I just want to say again that we can come to know this hope when we study the hope of the African slaves here in America. Because I guarantee you, that is the hope of Jesus Christ, the Gospels. The hope that the masters, right, that the white masters were preaching about, I promise you, that is not the hope of Jesus Christ, right? And James Cone elaborates on this point. He says that for many Black slaves, Jesus became the decisive other in their lives who provided for them a knowledge of themselves, not derived from the value system of slave masters. How could Black slaves know that they were human beings when they were treated like cattle? How could they know that they were somebody when everything in their environment said they were nobody? How could they know that they had a value that could not be defined by dollars and cents when the symbol of the auction block was an ever-present reality? Only because they knew that Christ was present with them, and that his presence was included the divine promise to come again and take them to the New Jerusalem. Heaven, therefore, in Black religion was inseparably connected with Jesus' promise to liberate the oppressed from slavery. It was Black people's vision of a new identity for themselves, which is in a sharp contradiction to their present status as slaves. The vision of Jesus as the coming one who will take them back to heaven held Black people together mentally as they struggled physically to make real the future in their present. The vision of Christ's future that breaks into their slave existence radically changes their perspective of life. When we come to know the hope of Jesus Christ, the hope of who he was and who he is and who he will be, the hope of the Jesus of the Gospels, our perspective on life will be radically changed. You know, our present status as slaves does not mean that is our identity. And with that hope, we can eventually break those chains that hold us down. This is what Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, brings to us. He brings freedom and he brings life. And these are points that James Cone is really emphasizing. And this is why I really love this book right here. Because we don't talk about this enough. And I think that this is something that we need to talk about, especially right now in our present context. And it keeps saying, it says, when Jesus is understood as the coming one who will establish divine justice among people, then we will be able to understand why Black slaves' religion emphasized the other world. They truly believed the story of Jesus' past existence with the poor as told in the Bible. Indeed, their own power to struggle to be human was due to the presence of Jesus with them. From his past history with the weak and his present existence with them, Black people received a vision of his coming presence to fully heal the misery of human suffering. Guys, this present struggle that we're currently seeing play out in our world is directly related to the coming of Jesus. You see, it's really easy to be discouraged when people are oppressing you. But when we have that hope of Jesus Christ in our lives, nothing can stop us. You know, we won't be subject to oppression. We will not be subject to people getting killed just because of the color of their skin. We won't be subject about people getting kicked out of churches and homes and families just because of their sexual orientation, right? We will not be subject to that stuff. Jesus Christ says we should not be subject to that. And because the hope of Jesus coming lives inside of us, we can stand up and fight against these things. That's really what I'm trying to say here, and what James Cone is really trying to say here. And all of this leads us, right? This Jesus is who he was, Jesus is who he is, and Jesus is who he will be, leads us to this context about this fourth and last point of Jesus is black. What does it mean to say that Jesus is black? Well, I'll tell you one thing for sure. Jesus isn't white, right? I mean, how many of you guys grew up in your churches or in your homes with a picture of a white Jesus? Honestly, y'all should just throw that away, because that's not like physically appearance. That probably isn't what Jesus looked like. I mean, James Cone isn't saying Jesus was black in physical appearance. I mean, to be honest, he was probably closer to black. He was probably more like a brown man, but he's not talking about skin color. But I just wanted to just point that out real quick if you hadn't recognized that yet. This is what James Cone means when he says that Jesus is black. He says that Christ's blackness is both literal and symbolic. His blackness is literal in the sense that he truly becomes one with the oppressed blacks, taking their suffering as his suffering, and revealing that he is found in the history of our struggle, the story of our pain, and the rhythm of our bodies. The least in America are literally and symbolically present in black people. I mean, it's true. You look at the least in America, right? I mean, how does the phrase goes? 3/5 of a man, shout out to Jay-Z. He put me on. But it's true. Black people are the least in America, right? Brown people are the least in America. Red people are the least in America. And it's saying here that because the least in America are literally and symbolically present in black people, to say that Christ is black means that black people are God's poor people whom Christ has come to liberate. Christ has come to liberate black, brown, and red people here in America. And thus no gospel of Jesus Christ is possible in America without coming to terms with the history and culture of that people who struggle to bear witness to his name in extreme circumstances. To say that Christ is black means that God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, not only takes color seriously, he also takes it upon himself and discloses his will to make us whole, new creatures, born in the spirit of divine blackness and redeemed through the blood of the black Christ. Christ is black, therefore, not because of some cultural or psychological needs of black people, but because and only because Christ really enters into our world, where the poor, the despised, and the black are disclosing that he is with them, enduring their humiliation and pain, and transforming oppressed slaves into liberated servants. Indeed, if Christ is not truly black, then the historical Jesus lied. God did not anoint him to preach good news to the poor, and neither did God send him to proclaim release to the captives and recovering the sight to the blind, to set liberty to those who are oppressed. If Christ is not black, the gospel is not good news to the oppressed, and Mark's observation is right. Religion is a sign of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of a spiritualist situation. It is the opium of the people. Guys, Christ is not the opium of the people. Christ is black. Jesus did live. Jesus does live, and Jesus will come back. And because all that is true, then Jesus endures the present suffering of black people. Jesus endures the present suffering of the marginalized and the oppressed in our communities, and Jesus is calling us into freedom. And I'll end with this last little section that James Cone says. To tie it all together, James Cone ends it like this: my point is that God came and continues to come to those who are poor and helpless for the purpose of setting them free. And since the people of color are his elected poor in America, any interpretation of God that ignores black oppression cannot be Christian theology. The blackness of Christ, therefore, is not simply a statement about skin color, but rather the transcendence affirmation that God has not ever, no, not ever, left the oppressed alone in struggle. He was with them in Pharaoh's Egypt, is with them in America, Africa, and Latin America, and will come in the end of time to consummate fully their human freedom. These are the conversations that we need to have. These are the fruits of the Spirit. Jesus Christ is coming to liberate, and Jesus Christ is calling us into freedom. It's my prayer that if you're watching this, that you really think about these words. If I didn't make sense, please go pick up God of the Oppressed and read it for yourself. I think it's time right now in 2020 that as believers and Christians, that we really take on this identity of the liberating Christ that lives inside of us. Because too many people have died, too many people have lost loved ones, too many people continue to suffer. There's so much injustice around our world, and we can't just sit idly by and waiting for the second coming, right? We can't just wait for those pearly gates and those gold streets. Jesus Christ is calling us now into our context to make his second coming a reality. And we do that by fighting for freedom. Thank you guys so much for watching. And please leave a like, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this. Share it with someone. And like I said, stay tuned. Hopefully by next week, we'll be starting our book, Just Mercy. So you have about a week to pick it up. So make sure to do that. And blessings, stay safe, and make sure to wear a mask anytime you go outside. Thank you.